They'll hunt us down. Runaway twins reached his porch. A hunter loaded his rifle and said, "Stay." Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The wind howled through the dense trees, carrying with it the smell of earth and wet leaves. The sun was beginning to set behind the towering mountains, casting long shadows over the forest floor. From the small, humble cabin nestled against the edge of the woods, a solitary figure watched the horizon. A rifle rested in his hands, the cold steel feeling familiar, the weight of his past heavy on his shoulders. He had been alone for years, living in the isolation of the wilderness, far from the noise of the world. His life was simple: hunt, gather, and survive. But tonight, something was different. He had sensed it long before the sound of footsteps reached his ears. Something was coming. The faint crunch of twigs underfoot, the soft rustling of leaves. It wasn't the usual animal he'd been accustomed to hearing. It was something else. And then, he saw them. Two young figures running, their faces pale with fear. They were twins, no older than 12, and they looked like they had been running for a long time. Their clothes were torn, their eyes wide with terror. They didn't stop as they reached the porch. The boy, who looked just a little stronger than his sister, stumbled as he ran up the steps. His breath came in short gasps, and he could barely hold on to his sister, who was equally breathless and exhausted. They barely managed to whisper, "Please, help us, they'll hunt us down." The hunter stood motionless, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. He didn't need to ask who they were running from. He could see the fear in their eyes, and he knew there was something deadly after them. He had seen enough of the world to recognize the look of those on the run, the hunted. He stepped forward slowly, placing his rifle against the wall of the cabin and crouching down to meet their gaze. "Who is after you?" he asked, his voice low, but carrying the weight of a man who had seen much. The twins exchanged a glance, their eyes darting nervously toward the woods. "The men, the bad men. They took our home. They took our parents. They said they'd find us." The boy finally spoke, his voice trembling. "They won't stop until we're dead," the girl added, her voice barely a whisper. The hunter's heart hardened. He had seen cruelty before. He had lived through it. But this was different. These were just children, and he couldn't ignore their plight. With a swift motion, he gestured for them to come inside. "Stay with me," he said firmly. "They won't find you here." He closed the door behind them, locking it with a quiet click. The twins huddled by the fire, their bodies still shaking. The hunter walked over to the small window, peering through the cracks in the wood. He knew the danger was near, and yet, there was something more that called to him. A responsibility to protect these children, even if it meant risking everything. They had nowhere else to go, and as the night deepened, the wind howled louder. The hunter knew the choice had already been made. He would keep them safe, no matter the cost. Tonight, the forest would become their sanctuary, but only if he could stand between them and the threat that was closing in. The wind had started to pick up, the rustling of leaves outside the cabin growing louder with each passing moment. Inside, the twins huddled by the warmth of the fire, their faces pale and their bodies still trembling from the long run through the woods. The hunter, a man who had lived alone for many years in the wilderness, could not help but feel a weight settle on his chest. These children were now in his care, and that came with a responsibility that he could not ignore. He had been used to solitude, to the quiet rhythm of the forest, but this was different. He could hear the distant sound of horses' hooves, faint at first, but growing louder, coming closer to the cabin. He stepped over to the window, peering through the cracks in the wooden frame, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. The night was falling fast, but the light from the fire flickered in the dark, casting long shadows against the walls of the small cabin. He could hear the twins' anxious breathing behind him, and for a brief moment, he wondered if he had made the right decision. Should he have let them go, sent them on their way to escape this danger? He quickly silenced the thought. He had no choice now. They were here, and he would protect them, even if it meant risking everything. The sound of horses was unmistakable now, and the hunter could feel the familiar rush of adrenaline as his body prepared for the confrontation. He grabbed his rifle from the wall, checking the ammunition, ensuring everything was in place. The twins looked up at him, their wide eyes filled with fear. The boy whispered, "Are they coming?" The hunter did not answer immediately. He simply nodded, his gaze steady and resolute. "Stay low," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of a man who had seen violence before. He moved toward the door, opening it just enough to peek outside. The moonlight cast a silver glow over the forest, and in the distance, he could see the figures of men on horseback, moving toward the cabin with purpose. There was no mistaking their intent. These men were here for the children. The hunter knew he had little time. He closed the door quietly behind him, locking it with a practiced motion, and turned to face the twins. "Stay in here. Do not make a sound," he instructed. The twins nodded, their faces pale with fear, but they did as they were told, crouching down against the wall. The hunter took a deep breath, steadying his hands as he positioned himself near the door. His heart was racing, but his mind was clear. He had trained for this moment, had prepared for the day when someone would come after him or someone he cared for. And now that time had come. The men outside were getting closer. He could hear the crunch of gravel beneath their boots, the low murmurs of their voices, and the jingle of their horses' tack. They were too close, and there was no way to avoid a confrontation. The hunter gripped his rifle tightly, his finger brushing the trigger. He knew he had to act quickly. As the men reached the porch, the hunter stepped forward, his boots silent on the wooden floor. The door opened slowly, the cold night air rushing in as the figures of the men emerged from the shadows. "You're not welcome here," the hunter said, his voice low and commanding. The men froze, their eyes narrowing as they saw the rifle aimed directly at them. For a moment, there was silence, a tension hanging in the air. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, sneered. "We're just here for the kids," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Hand them over, and we'll leave." The hunter did not flinch. He had heard this before, the threats, the promises of safety, but he knew better. These men would not leave without bloodshed. "Not happening," the hunter replied, his voice firm. He could see the leader's eyes flicker with annoyance, but the hunter was already one step ahead. He fired a warning shot into the air, the loud crack of the rifle echoing through the forest. The men flinched, but they did not move. "Leave now," the hunter commanded, "or the next shot will be for you." The leader's eyes locked onto the hunter's, and for a brief moment, it seemed like a battle of wills. The hunter was not backing down, and the leader knew it. After a tense silence, the leader grunted and turned, signaling for his men to retreat. Slowly, they backed away, their eyes never leaving the hunter. The hunter did not lower his rifle until they were out of sight, the sound of their retreating footsteps fading into the night. When he finally turned back to the cabin, the twins were still there, huddled together in silence. The hunter exhaled, the adrenaline slowly fading from his system. He knew this was only the beginning. The men would return, and next time, they would not be so easily deterred. But for now, the twins were safe. He walked over to them, his voice softening. "It's over for now. You're safe." The boy looked up at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. The hunter nodded. "No need to thank me," he said. "I'm just doing what needs to be done." The twins stayed close, knowing that they could trust this man, this silent protector, who had already given so much to keep them safe. The night was far from over, but for now, they had one another. The next morning, the hunter stood by the window, his eyes scanning the horizon, the rising sun casting long shadows over the land. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. He could feel the tension in the air, the stillness that warned of danger close by. The twins were asleep, curled up by the fire, exhausted from the events of the previous night. He knew they needed rest, but there was no time to waste. He had to move them, to keep them safe. He could already hear the distant echo of hooves, the sound of men coming back for what they believed was theirs. The hunter turned from the window and walked over to the twins, gently waking them. "We need to leave now," he said in a low voice. The boy stirred first, blinking his eyes as he looked up at the hunter. The girl followed, rubbing her eyes sleepily, but the fear was already returning to her face. "Are they back?" the boy asked, his voice shaky. The hunter nodded, his face hardening. "They'll come again. And next time, they'll bring more men. The twins didn't need to ask any more questions. They had learned quickly that when the hunter said it was time to go, there was no argument. They stood up, their bodies stiff from the cold, and quickly packed what little they had. The hunter helped them, his movements efficient and calm. He wasn't going to let them down, not after everything they had been through. Outside, the morning air was crisp, the sky a pale blue, but it was the kind of calm before the storm that made the hunter uneasy. They weren't safe yet. He could feel it in his bones. The hunter led the way, moving swiftly through the woods, his eyes constantly scanning for any sign of pursuit. The twins followed closely behind, staying close to him, relying on him as their protector. The forest around them seemed to close in, the trees thick and dense, but the hunter knew this land. He had lived here for years, and it was his refuge. Still, as he glanced back at the twins, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. His instincts told him they weren't alone, and as much as he wanted to deny it, he couldn't ignore the growing sense of danger. They reached the river by midday. The current was fast, the water churning with the remnants of the recent rain. The hunter paused, assessing the situation. "We'll need to cross," he said, his voice steady. The twins looked at the rushing water nervously, but the hunter was already tying their packs tightly. He knew it would be a risk, but it was their only way to escape. "Stay close," he warned them. The boy nodded, his face set with determination, while the girl clutched her brother's hand tightly, her eyes wide with fear. They waded into the water, the cold rushing around their legs, but the hunter kept a firm grip on them, guiding them through the current. It was slow and treacherous, the rocks beneath their feet slippery, but they managed to make it across. They were wet and cold, but safe, for now. The hunter led them along the bank, moving quickly as the day began to fade. They needed shelter, somewhere to rest, and regroup before the next move. As the sun set behind them, casting an orange glow over the horizon, they found a small cave tucked into the side of the mountain. It wasn't much, but it would keep them hidden. The hunter lit a small fire, enough to keep the chill at bay, but not enough to attract attention. The twins sat close to the fire, their faces tired but grateful. They hadn't spoken much, but the bond between them was undeniable. They had come so far together, and they weren't about to stop now. "We'll stay here for the night," the hunter said, settling down next to them. "Tomorrow, we'll move on. We'll find somewhere safer." The boy looked up at him, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you for saving us," he said quietly. The hunter didn't respond at first. He simply stared into the fire, the flames dancing and flickering in the dim light. He had done what he had to do, but he knew the danger was far from over. They were safe, for now, but the men who hunted them were relentless, and the hunter was certain they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. "You don't have to thank me," he finally said. "I'm just doing what needs to be done." He glanced over at the twins, his expression softening. "Stay close to me," he added. "I'll make sure no one gets to you." As the night grew darker and the wind picked up outside, the twins huddled closer to the fire. The hunter kept watch, his rifle by his side, his senses alert. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep them safe, but he would try. He had no other choice. And as the stars twinkled high above, he silently made a vow. No matter what it took, he would protect them, even if it meant risking his own life. The wind howled through the narrow cave entrance, carrying with it the biting chill of the approaching winter. The hunter kept the fire low, its flickering light casting long shadows against the walls. The twins huddled together, wrapped in blankets, but their eyes were wide with fear, their minds racing with the thought of what could be waiting outside. The boy, barely 12 but already showing the weight of his fears, looked up at the hunter. "Do you think they'll find us here?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The hunter paused for a moment, his face unreadable as he stared into the flames. The question hung in the air, and for a split second, he considered telling them the truth, that they were safe, for now, but that the threat wasn't over. Instead, he gave them the only answer he could. "We'll be ready." His voice was steady, but even he could feel the tension in his chest. He knew how relentless the men were who were hunting the children, how far they would go to get what they wanted. He had been around enough danger to know that there was no such thing as true safety, not for long. The wind outside whistled, and the shadows danced eerily on the walls of the cave. The twins sat closer to the fire, their faces drawn with exhaustion, but their minds restless. The boy, despite his fear, seemed to want to understand. He looked up at the hunter again. Why are they after us? The hunter's eyes darkened, but he didn't turn away. Because they believe you know something. Something they want, he replied, his voice low. And they will stop at nothing to get it. The twins exchanged a glance, their faces puzzled. They had no idea what the hunter meant, but the terror in his voice told them enough. The hunter continued, his eyes never leaving the fire. You've already seen what they're capable of. They'll do whatever it takes to find what they need. And that includes hurting people. The girl, clutching her brother's hand tightly, spoke up, her voice trembling. But we don't know anything. We were just running. We don't know why they're after us. The hunter's gaze softened for a moment as he looked at them, his face hardening with resolve. I know you don't. But to them, it doesn't matter. They won't stop until they get what they want. The boy looked at the hunter with wide eyes. Will you stop them? The hunter gave a grim nod. I'll do everything I can to protect you. You have my word on that. The wind howled louder, as if echoing the threat that hung over them. The twins settled back into the cave, the warmth of the fire providing a brief comfort against the cold. But the hunter didn't relax. He couldn't. He was too aware of the danger closing in. He kept his rifle close by, his eyes constantly scanning the entrance to the cave. He knew the moment the men arrived, they would be ready to strike. He had fought before, and he would fight again if it came to that. But what weighed heavily on his mind was not just the fight ahead, but what would happen to these children if they couldn't escape. His life had always been one of survival, but now, it was about something more. He had promised to protect them, and he would keep that promise, no matter the cost. As the night stretched on, the hunter couldn't help but think of the life he had lived before all this. A life of solitude, of silence, of the quiet rhythm of the forest. But now it was different. The twins had come into his life, and with them, they had brought a new kind of responsibility. The hunter had lived in isolation for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to care for someone else. But now, he was their protector. And in this moment, it felt like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. He had to keep them safe. He had to make sure that no matter what happened, they would survive. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the cave as the twins slept fitfully. The hunter kept watch, his eyes darting between the darkness outside and the children beside him. He knew the men would come soon, and when they did, he would be ready. There was no turning back now. His past had led him here, and now, his future was tied to these two innocent lives. The forest outside was silent, but the hunter's senses were on high alert. The storm was coming, and he would not let it take them. The first light of dawn broke through the trees, casting a soft glow across the clearing. The hunter sat against a rock, eyes scanning the horizon. He hadn't slept a wink. His mind kept racing, replaying the events of the previous night. The men would come. He knew it. The silence of the forest felt like an eerie warning, a prelude to what was about to unfold. His instincts, honed over years of living alone in the wild, were on high alert. The twins stirred behind him, the boy waking first, his eyes wide with the memory of their escape. He sat up and looked at the hunter. Do you think they'll come soon? He asked, his voice still hoarse with sleep. The hunter didn't turn to face him. Instead, he rose to his feet, his movements slow but deliberate. They'll come when they're ready, he said. But we won't wait for them. We need to move. The boy nodded, understanding the urgency in the hunter's voice. The girl woke, rubbing her eyes, and sat up beside her brother. She looked to the hunter, her face still pale but a determined look in her eyes. Where will we go? She asked quietly. The hunter took a deep breath, glancing around the camp before answering. We're going deeper into the forest, away from the roads, away from any place they can find us. He moved to his pack, checking the supplies once more. There was only enough for a few days, maybe a week if they rationed carefully. The forest was his home, but even here, food could be scarce when one was on the run. But he wasn't about to let them starve. He would find a way. He had to. The twins watched as he packed, their faces showing both fear and trust. They didn't know much about survival, but they knew the hunter had saved their lives. They had no one else to turn to. They were his responsibility now, and despite the dangers, he couldn't abandon them. He packed his rifle carefully, making sure it was within easy reach. The forest was full of threats, both human and animal. He couldn't afford to be careless. Once everything was packed, he turned to the twins. Stay close, he said, and keep quiet. We're not far from the edge of the forest, and there are still some roads nearby. We don't want to be seen." The boy nodded and grabbed his sister's hand, and they followed the hunter into the thick woods. The forest was dense, the trees towering above them, blocking out much of the morning light. The air was cool and crisp, a welcome relief from the heat of the past few days. As they walked, the hunter led them along a well-worn path that twisted and turned through the trees. It was a route he knew well, one he had used in the past to evade any unwanted attention. Still, he didn't let his guard down. Every crack of a twig underfoot, every rustle in the leaves, had him on edge. The twins were silent, but the fear in their eyes was unmistakable. They didn't understand the full extent of what was happening, but they knew enough to sense the danger. They kept close to the hunter, their small footsteps barely making a sound in the thick underbrush. After a few hours of walking, the hunter finally stopped. He scanned the area, listening intently. The silence was almost oppressive. Nothing moved, nothing stirred. He exhaled slowly and turned to the twins. "We'll make camp here for a while," he said. "We'll rest, but keep watch." The men could be close. The twins nodded, their faces drawn with exhaustion. They sat by the small fire the hunter had quickly started, wrapping themselves in their blankets. The boy looked up at the hunter again. "Do you think we'll make it?" he asked. The question hung in the air, unanswered. The hunter looked at the boy, his expression unreadable. He didn't want to lie to them, didn't want to give them false hope. But he also couldn't bring himself to tell them the truth. That they were running out of time. That no matter how far they ran, the men would always be close behind. "I won't let them take you," he said finally, his voice firm. The boy seemed to relax slightly at the promise. The girl, however, still looked worried. She turned to the hunter, her voice quiet. "Why are they doing this to us?" she asked. "What do they want?" The hunter hesitated, his gaze distant as he thought of how to answer. He had his suspicions, but he didn't want to fill their heads with fear. They had enough to deal with already. "They want something," he said finally. "But I don't know what. We'll figure it out. Just stay close to me." The girl nodded, though the unease didn't leave her face. The hunter knew it wasn't enough to simply survive. He had to protect them, find out who these men were, and why they were hunting down innocent children. But for now, survival was the only thing that mattered. The fire crackled in the still air, the flames dancing as they warmed their small camp. The hunter sat on the edge of the firelight, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows. He didn't sleep that night. He couldn't afford to. He was their protector now, and he would do whatever it took to keep them safe, even if it meant facing the danger head-on. The crackling of the fire was the only sound in the quiet night. The twins sat close to the flame, their faces gaunt with exhaustion, their eyes still wide with the fear of the hunt that had brought them to this point. The hunter had made sure they were settled in the small cave, hidden deep within the dense woods, away from any prying eyes. He kept watch from the entrance, his rifle within arm's reach, his senses sharpened. The wind howled through the trees, but the forest was otherwise still. It was the calm before the storm, and the hunter knew it. He had heard the rumors, whispers of men who never stopped hunting, relentless in their pursuit. The twins were not safe, not yet. He couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still to come. The fire flickered, casting long shadows on the walls of the cave. The boy, sitting close to his sister, looked up at the hunter. "Will they come tonight?" he asked, his voice filled with unease. The hunter's gaze remained fixed on the darkened woods. "They will come when they're ready," he replied, his voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent of warning. "We won't be caught off guard." The boy nodded, his small hand tightening around his sister's. She was silent, but the worry was evident in her eyes. They didn't understand why these men were after them, only that they had been chased relentlessly, running for their lives without knowing why. It was a cruel thing, to be hunted without reason. But the hunter knew all too well how quickly the world could turn violent. He had seen it before, seen the destruction that greed and power could bring. And now, it was here, knocking at his door. "How much longer will we be running?" the girl asked softly, her voice trembling. The hunter turned to face her, his expression softening for a moment. "As long as it takes," he said, his tone steady. "You're safe with me. I won't let them take you." But even as he spoke those words, the hunter knew they weren't out of danger yet. The men who were hunting them wouldn't stop, not until they had what they wanted. The sound of hooves in the distance cut through the silence, and the hunter's hand immediately went to the rifle beside him. His heart raced, his senses alert. The sound was faint at first, but it was unmistakable. Riders. They were getting closer. He rose to his feet, motioning for the twins to stay low. They nodded, their faces pale, but they obeyed, huddling together in the corner of the cave. The hunter stepped quietly to the entrance, his eyes scanning the dark trees outside. His instincts told him the riders were not far off. They were coming. The hunter's breath was steady, but his mind was racing. He couldn't afford to let them find the twins. He had to act quickly, before they were discovered. The riders approached the cave, their voices low, too far to hear clearly, but the hunter could tell they were searching. He knew they had to be close, but he had a plan. The hunter moved swiftly, silently, circling around the back of the cave to a narrow path that led to a hidden exit. He had used this route before, but tonight, it would serve a different purpose. The twins didn't know this path, but the hunter couldn't risk leading them through the front. It was too dangerous. He gestured for the twins to follow him, and they stood up, their eyes filled with uncertainty. "Trust me," he whispered. The boy nodded, and the girl gripped his hand tightly. The hunter led them through the dark, the path narrow and steep. The sounds of the riders were growing louder, but the hunter moved quickly, his mind focused on the goal. They reached the back exit just as the first of the riders came into view. The hunter signaled for the twins to keep moving. He stayed behind for just a moment longer, peering around the corner of the cave, watching as the riders approached. They were too close, and the hunter knew he had no choice. He had to keep them away from the twins, even if it meant putting himself in danger. With a deep breath, he stepped forward, moving quietly along the rocks, his rifle ready. The riders were almost there. The hunter aimed carefully, taking in the distance. He waited until the perfect moment, then fired. The shot echoed through the night, a loud crack in the stillness. The rider closest to the cave stopped in his tracks, a shout of alarm coming from his lips. The others halted, turning toward the sound. The hunter moved quickly, silently retreating deeper into the woods, the twins following closely behind. He didn't look back, but he knew the riders would follow. The pursuit was inevitable. The hunter's heart pounded in his chest as he led the twins through the dense woods. The path was treacherous, full of rocks and fallen branches, but he knew it well. It was a winding route that led them to a river, the current fast and strong. The hunter stopped at the riverbank, glancing back. The riders were not far behind. He had to make a decision, and fast. Without hesitation, the hunter turned to the twins. "We have to cross," he said, his voice firm. "Stay close to me. Don't let go." The twins looked at the river, its rushing water looking impossible to cross. But there was no time to waste. They had no choice. The hunter stepped into the water, the cold rushing around his legs. The twins followed closely behind, the boy gripping the hunter's arm tightly, the girl holding her brother's hand. They waded through the fast-moving water, each step a struggle against the current. But the hunter was determined. They had to make it. They had no other choice. The cold river water splashed against their legs as they struggled to keep their footing, the current pulling at them with every step. The hunter led the way, his body braced against the force of the water, his eyes scanning the surroundings. He could hear the twins' heavy breathing behind him, the sound of their feet slipping on the rocks. The river was wide and fast, but it was the only way to get further into the forest, to the safety they desperately needed. The boy clung to the hunter's side, his small hand wrapped tightly around the hunter's arm. The girl followed, her grip on her brother's hand almost frantic. "We're almost there," the hunter murmured, trying to steady them both as they navigated the slippery stones beneath their feet. His heart was racing, not from the cold of the water, but from the knowledge that the men pursuing them were relentless. He had delayed them for now, but they would come again. The riders wouldn't stop. The sound of hooves was still in the back of his mind, though he didn't dare look behind them. The forest had a way of swallowing up the sound, but he knew the men were still out there. When they reached the other side, the hunter helped the twins onto the bank, their clothes soaked and their faces pale with fear. The boy collapsed to the ground, breathing heavily, while the girl stayed close, her eyes scanning the trees, as if expecting the men to appear from behind every branch. The hunter knelt beside them, his fingers quickly working to untie their packs. "We need to move," he said, his voice low but firm. "They'll be here soon. Stay quiet." The twins nodded, their wide eyes locked on the hunter as they stood up slowly. The fear was still there, but so was the trust. They had no choice now but to follow him. They had to. The hunter led them through the dense underbrush, moving swiftly but silently. He knew this part of the forest well. It was familiar to him, a place he had hunted and tracked for years. But now, it felt different. The trees seemed to close in around them, the shadows deeper than before. The danger was real. The forest felt both like a sanctuary and a trap. Every step they took brought them closer to safety, but every step also made them more vulnerable. They had to keep moving. The hunter paused for a moment, listening intently. He heard nothing but the wind rustling through the trees, the occasional call of an owl in the distance. But his instincts told him to stay alert. They weren't alone. He motioned for the twins to crouch low, and they obeyed, huddling together behind a thick cluster of shrubs. The hunter crouched beside them, his hand resting on his rifle. He peered through the foliage, his eyes scanning the forest ahead. The silence stretched on, heavy with tension. Then, he heard it. A distant sound, faint at first, but unmistakable. The sound of hooves. They were close. He turned to the twins, his voice barely a whisper. "Stay low. Don't make a sound." The twins nodded, their fear palpable in the air between them. They had no choice but to trust him, to do as he said. The hunter knew that if they were spotted now, it would all be over. They couldn't outrun them in the open. They had to stay hidden. The sound of hooves grew louder, closer now. The hunter's heart beat faster, his grip tightening around his rifle. He waited, every muscle in his body tense. He could feel the twins' nervous energy beside him, their bodies trembling with fear. But he didn't let them see it. He couldn't. They needed him now more than ever. The riders came into view, their horses moving steadily through the forest, their figures silhouetted against the fading light. The hunter held his breath, watching as the men rode past, barely a dozen feet away. The wind shifted, and for a moment, the scent of the horses and men reached him. They were so close. He could hear their voices, low and indistinct, as they spoke to each other, unaware of the hunter and the twins hiding just beyond the trees. The hunter stayed perfectly still, his muscles aching from the strain. The twins held their breath as well, their eyes wide with fear. The moment stretched on, an eternity of silence. Finally, the riders moved further into the woods, their hooves fading away as they passed. The hunter exhaled slowly, his body relaxing, though the tension still hung in the air. He turned to the twins. "It's not over yet," he said quietly. "We can't stay here. We need to keep moving." The boy nodded, though his face was pale and drawn with exhaustion. The girl didn't speak, but her hand tightened around her brother's. The hunter stood up slowly, offering a hand to each of them. They rose and followed him, keeping close as they moved through the forest once more. The hunter's mind was sharp, calculating their every move, every step. They had to stay ahead of the men. They had to survive. The night was falling fast, and the forest was growing darker, the shadows stretching long and deep. But the hunter's resolve was unshaken. He would protect them, no matter what. They were his responsibility now, and he would make sure they lived to see another day. The hours seemed to stretch on forever as the hunter led the twins deeper into the forest, the darkness thickening around them with every step. The boy was growing quieter, his once eager steps now slow and measured, worn out by the relentless journey. The girl, too, had grown more somber, her small hand tightly gripping her brother's. She had not said much since the near encounter with the riders, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. The hunter kept his pace steady, his every movement calculated. His mind was on high alert, his senses attuned to every sound in the night. The wind had picked up again, swirling through the trees and carrying with it the scent of the earth, the trees, and something else, a faint trace of smoke. The hunter stopped in his tracks, motioning for the twins to do the same. He crouched low, peering through the underbrush. The faint smell of smoke was stronger now, and it wasn't coming from the direction they'd just traveled. He narrowed his eyes, trying to make sense of the situation. "Stay close," he whispered. "We're going to check it out." The twins nodded, their faces pale but resolute. They trusted him, even though they couldn't fully understand the danger they were in. They had no other choice. The hunter moved cautiously, taking careful steps as they made their way toward the source of the smoke. His mind was racing. If the men had set up camp nearby, it was too close for comfort. The hunter had hoped to avoid any more encounters, but it seemed that fate had other plans. The smoke grew thicker, and as they neared, the sound of murmuring voices reached their ears. The hunter held up a hand, signaling for them to be still. They crouched low behind a thicket, peering through the branches. What they saw made the blood in the hunter's veins run cold. The camp was small, but there were at least 5 men gathered around a fire, their backs turned as they spoke in low voices. Their horses were tied nearby, grazing lazily. The hunter's gaze flicked over the men, noting their weapons, rifles slung over their shoulders, pistols at their sides. He recognized one of them immediately, the leader, the man with the scar running down his face. The hunter's grip tightened around his rifle. This was the man he had encountered before, the one who had threatened them, the one who had been so relentless in his pursuit. The hunter knew that if they were discovered now, there would be no escaping. He motioned for the twins to follow him as he slowly backed away from the edge of the thicket. They moved silently, every step careful and deliberate. The hunter's mind raced. He had to find a way to lead them out of this, to escape without being seen. They were too close to the men, and the forest offered little cover in the open ground ahead. As they moved deeper into the woods, the hunter's heart was heavy with the knowledge that they had no choice but to keep moving. The camp wasn't far, and the men would eventually start searching the forest. They would pick up their trail soon enough. "We need to get to higher ground," the hunter whispered. "Stay low and stay quiet." The twins followed without a word, their fear palpable in the air. They trusted him, but they didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation. They just knew they had to keep moving. The hunter led them to a steep incline, the ground soft and slippery beneath their feet. He glanced back once more, making sure they weren't being followed. The coast was clear for now, but he knew that wouldn't last. They had to get to a safer spot, far away from the men. As they climbed the incline, the hunter's thoughts raced. The men would be looking for them, and they couldn't afford another close call. He had to find a place where they could hide, somewhere the men wouldn't think to look. When they reached the top, the hunter took a deep breath, surveying the area. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. The forest stretched out before them, dark and silent, but there was a ridge to the west, a natural barrier that would give them a good vantage point. "We'll head west," the hunter said quietly. "Stay close, and don't make a sound." The twins nodded, their fear momentarily replaced by determination. They had no choice but to trust him. As they made their way across the ridge, the hunter's senses remained alert. The sounds of the forest were strangely quiet, the usual nocturnal creatures hidden in the dark. He couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They were so close to safety, yet still, the threat was looming, waiting to strike at the slightest mistake. The hunter pushed forward, the twins following closely behind. They had no choice but to keep moving, no choice but to survive. And as they climbed higher into the hills, the hunter vowed to himself that he would do whatever it took to protect them, no matter the cost. The cold wind bit at their faces as they climbed higher into the hills, the path growing steeper with every step. The hunter's boots crunched against the frozen earth, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. The twins followed closely behind, their steps hesitant but determined. The boy was silent, his face tight with fear, but the girl's eyes were full of something else, a quiet resolve. The hunter didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. Every step they took brought them closer to safety, but the danger was still very real. He could feel it in the air, the weight of it pressing down on him, the sense that they were being hunted, and there was no place left to hide. The ridge loomed ahead, a natural barrier that would give them a better vantage point, a place to regroup and plan their next move. It wasn't a perfect hiding spot, but it was all they had. He had to make it work. They reached the top of the hill just as the first light of dawn began to touch the sky, casting a pale glow over the land. The hunter crouched low, signaling for the twins to stay behind him. He scanned the area, his eyes darting back and forth, looking for any signs of movement. The forest stretched out before them, the trees barren and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The wind howled, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth. There was no sign of the men, but that didn't mean they weren't close. The hunter's instincts told him they weren't safe yet. He kept his voice low, barely above a whisper. "Stay here. Keep quiet. Don't move unless I tell you." The twins nodded, their eyes wide with uncertainty but trusting him. They huddled together, wrapping their arms around themselves for warmth. The hunter's mind raced. They couldn't stay here long. He needed to find a way to throw the men off their trail, to give them a chance to get farther into the hills, where they could blend in with the terrain and hide. But first, he needed to know where the men were. He motioned for the twins to stay hidden and began to move along the edge of the ridge. His movements were slow, deliberate, every step carefully measured. He was good at staying hidden, but he couldn't take chances. He knew that if they were spotted now, there would be no escaping. The forest seemed to close in around him as he crept forward, his eyes scanning the shadows, his ears straining to catch any sound. He reached a small outcrop of rocks and crouched down, peering through a gap in the stone. In the distance, he saw them, riders. The men were spread out in a loose formation, moving slowly through the forest, their heads down, searching for any sign of the twins. The hunter's heart beat faster, but his mind stayed calm. He needed to be patient. The riders were too far away to be a direct threat, but they were getting closer, and he didn't have much time. He watched them for a few more moments, calculating their movements, before he turned back to the twins. He had a plan. He had to move them again, further away from the men, but he needed to do it carefully. He retraced his steps, returning to the ridge where the twins were waiting. He crouched down beside them, keeping his voice low. "We need to move. Quietly. We'll go west, toward the river. It's our best chance." The twins nodded, their faces pale but resolute. The boy's eyes flicked nervously toward the ridge, where the riders were still visible, slowly drawing nearer. The hunter didn't wait for them to respond. He motioned for them to follow and led them westward, the sound of their feet muffled by the thick blanket of snow that covered the ground. The air was sharp, the cold seeping into their bones, but the hunter pushed them forward. There was no time to waste. The forest was quiet, too quiet, and the only sound was the crunch of their boots against the snow. The hunter's mind raced, thinking through every possible scenario. They had to stay one step ahead of the riders. If they were spotted again, they wouldn't get away so easily. They had to find a way to lose them, to get lost in the wilderness where the men wouldn't be able to track them. But as they moved deeper into the forest, the hunter couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The shadows seemed to move with them, the trees creaking under the weight of the wind. He could feel eyes on them, watching them from the darkness. He turned to the twins, his voice barely a whisper. "Stay close. We're almost there." They moved faster now, the urgency in the hunter's voice pushing them forward. The boy's face was pale, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts, but he kept going. The girl didn't say a word, but her hand never left her brother's. They were in this together, and they had no choice but to trust the hunter. They reached the river just as the sun rose fully above the horizon, casting a golden glow over the water. The current was strong, the water rushing past with a force that made it impossible to cross without careful thought. The hunter paused, his eyes scanning the area. "We'll have to cross here," he said, his voice low. "Stay close to me. We're almost free." The twins nodded, their faces tense, but they followed the hunter into the water, the cold biting at their skin as they waded through the river, the current pushing against them with every step. They had no choice. This was their only chance to escape. The river's cold current rushed around their legs, and the hunter's every muscle tensed as he led the twins through the water. The water was freezing, biting at their skin, but they had no choice. They had to keep moving. The boy stumbled a little, his feet slipping on the slippery rocks beneath the surface. The hunter's hand shot out, steadying him with one strong grip. "Keep your feet steady," he said, his voice low and firm. "We're almost there." The boy nodded, his small face filled with determination, though his teeth chattered from the cold. The girl was quiet, but she kept close to her brother, her eyes scanning the surroundings, as if expecting something to jump out at them from the darkness of the woods. The hunter didn't look back. He focused on the river ahead, the path they needed to take to escape. The land beyond was unknown, but it was their only hope now. They couldn't stay here. They couldn't let the men catch up. With each step, the water grew deeper, the current pulling harder. It was a struggle, but they made it to the far bank, the hunter helping the twins out of the water one by one. They climbed the muddy shore, their clothes soaked, but they were safe, for now. The hunter paused, catching his breath for a moment. His heart was still pounding from the adrenaline of the crossing. He wiped the water from his eyes and turned to face the twins. They were wet and shivering, their faces pale, but they were alive. "We need to move," the hunter said quietly. "We can't stop here. They'll follow our trail, and they won't stop until they find us." The twins nodded without a word, understanding the gravity of the situation. They had been running for so long now, with no end in sight. But they had come this far. They had to keep going. The hunter led them through the woods, keeping to the narrow trails where the ground was firmer, avoiding any open spaces. His sharp eyes were constantly scanning their surroundings, every sound, every movement setting off an alarm in his mind. The shadows were growing longer as the day wore on, and the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting a dull orange glow across the forest. It wouldn't be long before darkness fell, and the hunter knew they couldn't risk traveling through the night. "We'll make camp soon," he said, his voice low. The twins nodded, though they looked exhausted. Their bodies were sore from the cold river crossing, and the long journey through the forest was taking its toll. The hunter had been pushing them hard, but he knew they had no choice. They had to stay ahead of the riders. The farther they got, the better their chances of losing them. They moved deeper into the forest, and after a while, the hunter found a small clearing tucked between the trees. It was hidden from the main path, and the ground was dry, perfect for making camp. He quickly gathered some wood for a fire and set it up, making sure to keep it low to avoid being spotted from a distance. As the fire crackled to life, the twins sat down by its warmth, their clothes still damp but beginning to dry. The boy's face was pale, and he had his arms wrapped tightly around his knees. The girl was quiet, her eyes distant as she stared into the fire. The hunter sat across from them, his rifle by his side, always on guard. They had made it this far, but the night was far from over. The wind had picked up, the trees groaning under its force. The night felt heavy, oppressive, and the hunter's senses were heightened. He could feel the weight of the forest around him, the stillness that always preceded danger. The twins huddled close to the fire, their exhaustion evident in their slumped shoulders. The boy spoke first, his voice soft but full of fear. "Do you think they're still following us?" The hunter didn't answer right away. He sat back, staring into the flames, his thoughts racing. The truth was, he wasn't sure. He knew the men would be looking for them, but he didn't know how close they were. The only thing he knew for sure was that they couldn't let their guard down. "We won't stop moving," the hunter finally said. "We'll stay ahead of them." The boy nodded, but his face remained troubled. The girl said nothing. She simply stared into the fire, her small hands wrapped tightly around her knees. The hunter glanced at her, noticing how still she had become. She was the quiet one, the one who didn't speak much, but her fear was just as real as her brother's. He couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for them. They were just children, caught up in a world that didn't care about them. He had promised to protect them, but the reality of that promise weighed heavily on him. "We'll be okay," the hunter said, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it. "I'll keep you safe." The fire crackled again, the sound filling the silence. The wind howled through the trees, but in the distance, there was something else. A faint sound, barely audible over the wind. The hunter's senses immediately sharpened. His grip on the rifle tightened, and he stood, motioning for the twins to be still. They looked up at him, their faces stricken with worry. The hunter didn't speak. He listened, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness beyond the clearing. Then, it came again, the sound of hooves. Not distant this time. Closer. The riders were back. The sound of hooves grew louder, the pounding rhythm echoing through the trees. The hunter's heart raced, his every sense on high alert as he turned toward the twins. They were already huddled together, their wide eyes filled with fear. The boy gripped his sister's hand tightly, while the girl clutched her knees to her chest, her small form shaking. The fire crackled between them, casting shadows on their faces as the wind howled through the trees. The hunter's thoughts raced. He knew they couldn't stay here any longer. The riders were closing in, and if they didn't move quickly, they would be trapped. "Get up," he whispered urgently, his voice low but firm. "We need to move. Now." The twins didn't question him. They had learned to follow his every command without hesitation, even if they didn't fully understand the danger. The boy stood first, helping his sister to her feet. The hunter grabbed his rifle, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. They couldn't afford to make noise. Every rustle of a leaf, every snap of a twig could give them away. The hunter moved first, leading the twins away from the campfire, toward the thick trees. The sound of hooves grew louder, closer now. He could see the silhouettes of the riders in the distance, their figures barely visible through the trees. There were at least 4 of them, and they were headed straight for the clearing. The hunter's mind raced. He needed a plan. The only chance they had was to stay hidden, to make their way through the forest without being spotted. He gestured for the twins to follow him and moved quietly through the underbrush, his steps deliberate and careful. They stayed close, their breath shallow and quick as they navigated through the dense forest. The trees were thick, their branches reaching out like claws, but the hunter knew the land. He had spent years here, learning every path, every hidden corner. They moved swiftly, but not too fast, keeping low to the ground, avoiding the open spaces. The sound of the riders was now dangerously close, but the hunter didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. Every step they took could bring them closer to safety. The forest was their only ally, the only place they could hide. The hooves were now almost upon them. The hunter could hear the riders' voices, their words indistinct, but the tone was clear. They were searching for something. He glanced over his shoulder, making sure the twins were still behind him. They were, moving as quietly as possible, their faces filled with fear but also trust. The hunter didn't dare stop. He had to keep moving. He had to get them out of this alive. The riders were getting closer. He could feel their presence like a shadow creeping up behind them. They had to find cover, and fast. The hunter led them to a small rise in the ground, covered with thick brush and dense undergrowth. He signaled for the twins to crouch low, hiding behind the brush. They obeyed without question, their small bodies pressed to the ground, their breaths quiet but rapid. The hunter crouched beside them, his rifle ready, his eyes scanning the darkness. The riders were almost in the clearing now, their horses snorting as they slowed to a stop. The hunter held his breath, his body tense with anticipation. The riders spoke in low voices, their words muffled by the wind, but the hunter could hear them clearly enough. They were too close. The hunter's heart pounded in his chest as he waited, every muscle coiled like a spring. The riders' horses shifted restlessly, and the hunter knew it was only a matter of time before they spotted the trio. He couldn't risk that. The danger was too great. With a swift motion, the hunter pulled the twins deeper into the brush, moving quickly but quietly, making sure they stayed hidden. The sound of the horses grew fainter as they moved deeper into the forest, but the hunter's senses remained sharp. He didn't dare relax. Not yet. They had to get even farther from the riders before they could rest. The hunter moved quickly, but cautiously, the twins following closely behind. The forest was dense here, the trees thick and close together, but the path was narrow and winding. The hunter knew it well. He had used this route before, and it was their best chance to evade the riders. The hooves in the distance faded, but the hunter didn't stop. They kept moving. The boy stumbled slightly, his wet shoes slipping on the muddy ground, but the hunter steadied him with one hand. "Keep going," he whispered. "We're almost there." The boy nodded, his face tense with fear but determined. They had to get through this. They had to survive. The night seemed to stretch on forever as they moved through the dense woods, the trees towering above them, the moonlight barely filtering through the canopy. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine, the only sounds the crunch of their footsteps and the occasional distant howl of a wolf. After what felt like hours, they reached a small hollow, hidden from view. The hunter signaled for the twins to stop. They crouched low, their backs pressed against the trees, their faces hidden in the shadows. The hunter scanned the area once more, his eyes darting back and forth. They were hidden, for now, but the hunter knew it wouldn't last long. He could feel the riders getting closer, and it was only a matter of time before they found their trail. But they had made it this far, and they couldn't stop now. They had to keep moving. The hunter turned to the twins, his voice low. "Stay quiet. We'll move again soon." The twins nodded, their eyes wide, their breath shallow but steady. They were scared, but they trusted him. And that trust was the only thing keeping them going. The wind had picked up again, and the forest felt like it was alive with the movement of unseen things. The hunter kept his eyes fixed on the narrow trail ahead, the dim light from the fading moon barely illuminating the ground. The twins followed silently, their small footsteps barely making a sound in the thick underbrush. They were exhausted, their faces pale with fear, but they kept going, trusting the hunter to lead them to safety. Every so often, the hunter would glance back, checking to make sure they were still with him, still moving. The boy's eyes were wide, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement, but he didn't speak. The girl, too, remained silent, her grip tight on her brother's hand as they pushed through the thick trees. The night was oppressive, the silence broken only by the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. But the hunter knew that silence could be deceiving. They were still being hunted. The men who had been chasing them were relentless. The hunter had seen them before, and he knew they wouldn't stop until they had caught up. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. He had to keep them ahead of the riders, out of sight, out of reach. The trail ahead wound deeper into the forest, but the hunter had a plan. He knew the land like the back of his hand, and he knew that there was a cave not far from here, one that was well hidden and difficult to find. It was their best chance. They had to make it there before the riders did. He kept his pace steady, his eyes darting from one side of the path to the other, making sure there were no signs of pursuit. The wind carried a faint smell of smoke, a reminder that the riders were still out there, searching for them. The hunter's heart was pounding, but he didn't let it show. He couldn't afford to. He had to stay focused. The twins were relying on him. They had no one else. He led them off the main path, moving quickly but carefully, his mind calculating every step. They needed to get to the cave before the riders picked up their trail. The forest grew denser as they moved deeper into the hills, the trees thickening overhead, blocking out most of the remaining light. The air grew colder, and the hunter could feel the weight of the coming storm. He pushed forward, his breath steady but quick, the twins following closely behind. They had to get to shelter before the storm hit. The first raindrops began to fall just as they reached the cave, the wind picking up, carrying the promise of something worse. The hunter motioned for the twins to enter first, making sure they were safe inside before he followed. The cave was small, just big enough for them to sit close together and keep out of the wind. It was dark, but the hunter had carried a small lantern with him. He lit it, its soft glow casting flickering shadows on the cave walls. The twins huddled together, their faces pale and tired, but they were safe, for now. The hunter sat down across from them, his rifle resting against the wall, his senses still alert. He knew they couldn't stay here for long. The storm was coming, and the riders weren't far behind. He had to keep them moving, keep them ahead of the men hunting them. "We'll rest here for a bit," the hunter said quietly, his voice low. "But we can't stay long. We need to keep moving." The boy nodded without speaking, his face drawn with exhaustion. The girl's gaze was distant, her small hands trembling as she held on to her brother. They had been through so much already, and the weight of it was starting to show. But the hunter could see the strength in them. They were survivors, and they weren't giving up. The storm outside grew stronger, the wind howling through the trees, and the rain began to pour, heavy and fast, battering the ground outside. But inside the cave, they were sheltered from the worst of it. For a brief moment, the hunter allowed himself to relax, to breathe a little easier. They had made it this far, and they were still alive. But he knew it wouldn't last. The riders would be back, and they wouldn't stop. The hunter's mind raced with plans, with ways to keep them safe. But the truth was, there was no way to guarantee their safety. There was no place left to run, no place where they would be truly safe. The only thing the hunter could do was fight, to protect the twins as best as he could. And if it came down to it, he would fight to the end. As the storm raged on outside, the hunter stayed alert, his mind never straying from the task at hand. The twins sat quietly, their eyes heavy with fatigue, but they had come to trust the hunter completely. He was their protector now, and they had no choice but to follow him. The wind howled louder, but the hunter remained still, his gaze fixed on the entrance to the cave. The night was far from over, and he knew the worst was still to come. The storm raged outside, the wind howling through the trees, shaking the cave's entrance as if demanding to be let in. Inside, the hunter sat motionless, his rifle resting in his lap, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows. The twins sat huddled close together, their small bodies trembling from the cold, but they stayed silent, their trust in the hunter unwavering. The cave, though small and cramped, had provided them with temporary shelter from the storm, but they couldn't stay there forever. The riders' pursuit had been relentless, and though the storm had slowed their progress, it wouldn't last long. The hunter knew they couldn't afford to rest for much longer. His mind raced as he thought of their next move. He had to keep them ahead of the riders, away from their grasp. But as the storm outside intensified, he felt a pang of fear. They were running out of time. The crackling of the fire did little to break the tension in the cave. The hunter stood and moved towards the entrance, peering out into the darkness, straining his ears for any sounds of pursuit. The forest was quieter now, the wind muffling any noise. He couldn't hear the men, but that didn't mean they weren't close. He turned to the twins. "We're going to move again," he said in a low voice. "We need to keep ahead of them. Stay close and keep quiet." The boy nodded, his face pale but determined. The girl, her eyes wide with fear, clutched her brother's hand tighter but said nothing. The hunter gave them a reassuring glance before turning toward the dense forest. The rain had slowed, but the forest floor was still wet and treacherous. They couldn't risk being spotted in the open. He led the way, moving swiftly but carefully through the trees. The path ahead was narrow and winding, but he knew it well. The hunter's instincts told him the riders were closing in. He had to get them further into the hills, further away from the paths that the men would surely search. Every step was critical now. The twins followed closely, their small feet making little noise against the wet earth. The boy looked up at the hunter, his face full of quiet admiration. He had seen the way the hunter had moved earlier, the way he had kept them hidden from the riders. He was scared, but he knew they were safe as long as the hunter was with them. The girl stayed close to her brother, her eyes darting around the trees, scanning for any movement. They had been running for so long now, the fear of being caught weighing heavily on her small shoulders. But they had no choice. The hunter had promised to protect them, and they trusted him completely. The forest grew darker as they moved deeper into the hills, the trees thicker, the air colder. The hunter's steps grew slower, more cautious as they approached a steep ravine. The boy and girl followed silently, both of them unsure of what lay ahead but trusting that the hunter knew what to do. The hunter reached the edge of the ravine and knelt, peering down at the deep drop below. The ground here was treacherous, but it would give them a place to hide if needed. He turned to the twins. "We'll rest here for a moment," he said quietly, "but we need to stay out of sight. The riders will be looking for us soon." The twins nodded, their tired eyes watching the hunter closely. The boy asked, "What if they find us?" The hunter didn't answer right away. He stared out over the ravine, his mind working through their options. He knew they couldn't outrun the riders forever. They had to find a way to escape, a place where they could lose their trail completely. "We'll fight if we have to," the hunter said finally, his voice cold with resolve. "But I'll do everything I can to make sure that doesn't happen." The twins didn't say anything. They simply sat, their backs against the cool stone, their bodies shivering from the cold. The hunter glanced at them one last time before turning his attention back to the ravine. The night had fallen, and the forest was darker than ever. They couldn't stay here long. The storm had passed, but the danger was still very much real. The riders would be coming. The hunter could feel it in his bones. They had no time to waste. He rose to his feet, motioning for the twins to follow. "Stay close," he said. "We're not out of danger yet." They moved quickly, making their way down the narrow path along the ravine. The hunter led the way, always checking behind them, always on guard. Every sound in the forest was amplified, every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves setting his nerves on edge. But the forest was quiet, too quiet. The hunter's senses screamed at him, telling him they weren't alone. He glanced at the twins, seeing their nervous expressions as they kept pace with him. He had to act quickly. The only way out was forward. The only way to escape the riders was to push deeper into the hills, to lose them in the dense forest where no one could track them. The boy's voice broke the silence, his words barely audible over the wind. "Do you think we'll make it?" The hunter didn't answer right away. He couldn't promise them safety. He couldn't promise them that they would make it out alive. But what he could do was keep them moving, keep them fighting for another day. "We'll make it," he said finally, his voice steady but filled with the weight of their shared struggle. "We'll make it, because we don't give up." And with that, they pressed on, deeper into the forest, the hunter leading the way, and the twins following close behind, determined to survive, no matter the cost.